Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we have another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 51st deck and is titled If You Have Coin, Tajic Has Wares. Although I will be honest, in this case the wares are mostly just attack triggers and combat, so they may not be wares that our opponents necessarily want, but hey, we'll see how it goes. So if you haven't seen this show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So really quickly, before we get into the deck itself, I do want to very quickly highlight some of our social media accounts. If you are interested in getting updates on what we're doing for the decks, you can check us out on Twitter, on Reddit. You can always send us an email if you would like to know more or just get in contact with us. And then if you're interested in supporting our content, you can always use our affiliate link with TCG Player. Any cards you buy through that will give us a little bit of a kickback, and that's always very much appreciated. And if you'd like to support even more directly, we do have a Patreon account. The link to that is also in the description to the video. But all of the proceeds for that right now are going toward finding ways to record in-person games. So hoping to buy some new equipment, anything that's going to get us set up to record both in-person games and, of course, also keep recording the online games as well. And then joining the Patreon gives you access to a Discord, gives you access to playing in the games if you would like to participate, as well as links to the deck lists a bit early in case you want to peruse through those and maybe give us a little bit of feedback on how we're doing or if there's any cards we may have missed. So thank you for all of the support that you guys give us. And if none of these are your style, you can always like the video and subscribe as well. That does help. The channel has been growing quite a bit lately, so thank you to everyone who has recently joined and, of course, to the people who have been here for quite some time. So without any further ado, let's jump into our deck itself. And in this case, we have a random card by Kitchen Table Games on YouTube, and they suggested Tajic, Blade of the Legion. And Tajic is a 2 red-white legendary creature, human soldier. It's a 2/2, and Tajic has Indestructible and Battalion. So whenever Tajic and at least 2 other creatures attack, Tajic gets +5/+5 until end of turn. Now, when this was originally suggested, it was to see kind of how it matched up against Kitchen Table Games' own personal Tajic deck and seeing how some soldier, tribal, and some attack triggers could work with that. And so, obviously, I guess before I get too far ahead of myself, we should also mention that our commander for this game is also going to be Tajic because we got a legendary creature as our random card, so we got to put them in the command zone, see how they work. But as I was saying, our random card wanted to focus on soldiers and attacking and all that. Now, I did lean a little bit away from soldier tribal. I'll be honest, it was never something that really appealed to me. I've never been a big fan of the soldier tribe in general, so I didn't really want to put that together. But what I was interested in was that second ability from Tajic, the ability to attack with 2 other creatures. So I leaned very heavily into attack triggers. And so what that means for the themes for this deck, as I've already mentioned, leaning heavily into attack triggers. So we do have, to represent that, Adeling, Resplendent Cathar, 1 white for a star 4 human knight. She has Vigilance, and her power is equal to the number of creatures we control. And whenever you attack, for each opponent, create a 1/1 white human creature token that's tapped and attacking that player or a planeswalker they control. So Adeline is a great example of the attack triggers that we want to get in this deck. Adeline in particular, when she attacks, makes a 1/1 for each opponent we have. So if we have 3 opponents, we make 3 1/1s. She goes from being, at the smallest, a 1/4 into a 4/4. So that can be incredibly powerful. And when we're combining that with Tajic, who's able to get Battalion, we have plenty of other attack triggers, things like Battle Cry, things that want to pump our team, want to make tokens, want to put counters on things, want to do damage when they attack. So every sort of attack trigger you can possibly imagine is in here. We really aimed to turn our combat step into what we're mainly doing with this deck. Now, obviously, attack triggers can't be our only goal because there are ways that our opponents can get around that. So On top of that, we also have ways to make our creatures indestructible. Because if we're attacking or if our opponents just cast a board wipe, we need to be able to defend our board. And so cards like Make a Stand, which is 2 and a white for an instant, creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain indestructible until end of turn, become incredibly powerful. If we attack with Adeline and Tajic and we have a few other creatures on board, and our opponents decide they're going to make themselves safe and destroy all the creatures, we can cast this in response, keep our board, our opponents will still lose all of theirs, and then hopefully we're able to still kind of attack our way to victory. Now, on top of all of that, as weird as it may seem, considering we are a Boros deck, I tried for our third theme to focus very heavily on card draw. I wanted to make sure that we had enough cards in our hand to be able to deploy our threats, and in case we don't have something like Make a Stand, and we get board wiped and lose everything, I wanted to make sure we had backups. So a good example of that is Fey Steed, which is 2 white for a 4/4. Whenever Fey Steed attacks, another target attacking creature you control gains indestructible until end of turn. Awesome. And whenever a creature or planeswalker you control becomes the target of a spell or ability an opponent controls, you may draw a card. So if anyone tries to kill one of our creatures, whether that's with something simple like murder, or it could be something much more advanced, like something that targets each individual creature, maybe like a fireball, we still get to draw a card. So as long as our opponents target something, we draw a card. And that does include abilities as well. So if our opponents have something on the board that is tapping down our biggest creature every single turn, every time they tap it down, we get to draw a card. So Fey Steed can be incredibly powerful in a Boros deck because our opponents are going to want to remove our things, but it's also going to keep our hand nice and stocked. So if our stuff does actually get removed, we're able to just redeploy some more threats and just keep the ball rolling, hoping always to keep our opponents kind of on their toes. But those are our themes for the week. And after that, I do want to take a look at some key cards in the deck. Some cards that really synergize well with what we're trying to do and are kind of driving pieces behind a lot of this deck. So the first one of those is going to be Aggro, Master Tactician, which is 2 white for a legendary creature, human soldier. He's a 3/4 with first strike. And whenever Aggro and at least 3 other creatures attack, you choose which creatures block this combat and how those creatures block. So if we swing out with our entire board, we have Aggro, we can decide, 1, if our opponents block, because we could just say, nope, none of your creatures block, we hit you with everything, do a ton of damage, none of our creatures die. Or we can also pick and choose which among our opponent's things are going to block something that kills it but doesn't kill our creatures. So Aggro could force a 3/3 to block himself. He's got first strike, he kills it, and we kind of move on. So if our opponents have any annoying creatures, anything that's really getting in our way, we can force them to block so that way they can't use them after this combat step. And if there's nothing we really want to kill on our opponent's boards, then we just swing in with an unblockable team because our opponents can't block. So Aggro is absolutely phenomenal in this deck and pretty much lets us run our entire game plan and not worry about anything dying. And to kind of go along with Aggro, we have our second key card, which is Frontline Medic, 2 and a white for a human cleric, 3/3, has Battalion. So whenever Frontline Medic and at least 2 other creatures attack, creatures you control gain indestructible until end of turn. And we can also sacrifice Frontline Medic and counter target spell with X in its mana cost unless its controller pays 3. So for the most part, that second ability, not going to be incredibly relevant. I don't anticipate us ever countering an X spell, but it is a possibility. The key to Frontline Medic, though, is that first ability. Being able to attack with it and 2 other creatures and giving every single creature we control indestructible is super, super useful in this deck. That allows us to swing in with our board, not worry about anything dying, and then maybe we'll even get lucky enough in our second main phase to cast a board wipe, destroy all the creatures, we get to keep ours, our opponents lose all of theirs, and Frontline Medic is very difficult for our opponents to remove, because even though it only gives itself and other creatures indestructible on our turn, and when we attack, we have plenty of ways in the deck to give our creatures indestructible anyway. So we can kind of keep that as a backup just in case Frontline Medic doesn't work, to save our Frontline Medic and then make everything indestructible again. So Frontline Medic can really be a pain in the butt for our opponents if we're able to keep it running. And then finally, our last key card, and a personal favorite card of mine, is Coveted Jewel. Coveted Jewel is a 6-mana artifact. When it enters the battlefield, draw 3 cards. That's great considering we're in Boros. Tap, add 3 mana of any one color. Also great considering we're in Boros. And whenever one or more creatures an opponent controls attack you and aren't blocked, that player draws 3 cards and gains control of Coveted Jewel. Untap it. So if someone attacks us and we don't block them, they steal the Coveted Jewel and draw 3 cards. That obviously is a huge downside to this card, but you have to keep in mind too, we're going to be the aggro deck at the table. We're going to be the ones with attackers. So we might be able to make deals with our opponents and say, yeah, you can hit us for 1, hit us for 2, but we're going to take that jewel back. Because we are going to have so many creatures that are so strong, our opponents aren't going to want to block everything, or maybe even can't block everything, to stop us from getting the Coveted Jewel back. So we may genuinely be drawing 3 cards a turn every single turn with the Coveted Jewel. And it's also giving us an extra 3 mana. So Coveted Jewel, honestly, just an all-star. I put it in pretty much every mono-red, mono-white, Boros deck, or any deck that really cares about attacking. I always put a Coveted Jewel in. I absolutely love this card, and it's overperformed in most of the games I've seen it played in. So if you haven't ever played a game with Coveted Jewel, I highly recommend it. It is genuinely very powerful, even though it doesn't always look that way on the surface. But those are the key cards for this deck. So the next major piece of this is to take a look at some cool interactions, some cards that work very well together. And the first of the cool interactions is going to be between Adriana, Captain of the Guard, and Grenzo's Ruffians. So Adriana, Captain of the Guard, is 3 red, white for a 4/4 legendary creature human knight. She has melee, so whenever this creature attacks, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each opponent you attacked with a creature this combat, and other creatures you control have melee. Now the reason these two are paired together, though, is for the reminder text on her second ability. If a creature has multiple instances of melee, each triggers separately. So when we pair that up with another melee creature in Grenzo's Ruffians, which is 2/2 for a goblin melee, whenever Grenzo's Ruffians deals combat damage to an opponent, it deals that much damage to each other opponent. So if we just attack one opponent with Grenzo's Ruffians without Adriana on board, it would get +1/+1 from its melee trigger since we attacked one opponent. Hits that opponent for 3, which then does 3 damage to each other opponent. But if we partner that up with Adriana, we attack one opponent, Grenzo's Ruffians gets +1/+1 twice, so it becomes a 4/4, hitting that opponent for 4 and each other opponent for 4. But if we have more than these 2 creatures on board, we're able to attack all 3 opponents, meaning we get 6 individual melee triggers, turning Grenzo's Ruffians into an 8/8 creature, which does 8 damage to each of our opponents. So if we have something like Odric to make this indestructible, this can get out of hand very quickly, because all we have to do is, 1, use Odric to get our stuff unblockable, or just swing at the opponent who can't block it, because if one opponent takes it, they all have to take it. So Grenzo's Ruffians and Adriana, very powerful separately, but super, super useful together. And our next cool interaction, our second cool interaction, is going to be between Nadar, Selfless Paladin, and Thorough Investigation. Now, I will be upfront, these are the only 2 Venture cards in the deck, but they do work surprisingly well together. Granted, Venture works pretty well in this deck anyway because we want to be getting that extra value. So Nadar, Selfless Paladin, is 2 and a white for a legendary creature Dragon Knight. He's a 3/3 with Vigilance, and whenever Nadar, Selfless Paladin, enters the battlefield or attacks, venture into the dungeon. And other creatures you control get +1/+1 as long as you've completed a dungeon. And if we pair that up with Thorough Investigation, which is 2 and a white for an enchantment, whenever you attack, investigate. So we make a colorless clue artifact token with pay 2, sacrifice this creature, draw a card. And whenever you sacrifice a clue, venture into the dungeon. So on its own, venturing into the dungeon can get us some life gain. It can get us some counters or some treasure, some goblins, maybe scry. But when we pair Thorough Investigation and Nadar, we get to attack, venture into the dungeon, investigate, get a clue, pay 2, sacrifice a clue, draw a card, venture into the dungeon again, and then once we complete a dungeon, we give our entire team +1/+1. So this really lets us double up on our venture triggers, but it is also kind of just giving us card draw. Being able to make a clue every time we attack in Boros, super useful because that's going to let us draw the cards we need to, again, either protect our board or survive and keep rebuilding if our board gets wiped. So love these two together, love these two separately, but they are the only venture cards in the deck, so I do want to make sure that that is very clear. And now we come to the part that everyone's been waiting for, and that is the budget of the deck. And this week, we did get very close to our budget limit. We came in at $98.69, and a good portion of that is because of the Hero of Bladehold, which is $15.70, which is an absolutely astounding number, and I'm genuinely shocked we were able to fit this in. But Hero of Bladehold is 2 white for a creature, human knight, 3/4, battle cry. So whenever this creature attacks, each other attacking creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. And whenever Hero of Bladehold attacks, put 2 1/1 white soldier creature tokens onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking. So even if we play this on turn 4 and we have no other creatures on the board, it attacks on turn 5, makes 2 1/1s that are tapped and attacking, triggers Battle Cry, giving the other 2 1/1s +1/+0, meaning we can hit someone for 7 damage with this creature alone. So if we have any other creatures, that just gets exponentially more powerful. So Hero of Bladehold is amazing in this deck, and it really does what we want to be doing. However, it is a $15 card, and there's plenty of other creatures with powerful attack triggers. So if you're looking to trim the price down a little bit, get it down closer to $80, this would be the card to cut, unfortunately. It is good, but it's not that good if you're looking to keep the budget down. So definitely a card to think about cutting. If you have it, then we might as well put it in. But other than that, maybe you're interested in the really expensive cards, the cards that could go in this deck and honestly probably should go in this deck, but are a little bit out of our price range. Well, don't worry, I've got you covered. We have some cards that definitely should go in this deck, but I couldn't squeeze them in for budget reasons. And the first of them is going to look a little surprising because it's actually cheaper than Hero of Bladehold, and that is Iroas, God of Victory. And Iroas is 2 red-white for a 7/4 legendary enchantment creature god. He has Indestructible. As long as your devotion to red and white is less than 7, Iroas isn't a creature. Creatures you control have Menace, and prevent all damage that would be dealt to attacking creatures you control. So it doesn't technically have any attack triggers, but it gives all of our creatures Menace and makes sure that any attacking creatures we have can't be dealt damage. So that is incredibly useful. This allows us to swing into any opponent and not care at all about our creatures dying. Very similar to Frontline Medic, but arguably more powerful in the sense that it's not just indestructible because they can't be dealt damage at all, and it gives them Menace. So Iroas is an awesome card, and if you have one, I highly recommend putting it into this deck, but it is out of our budget, unfortunately, so we did have to skip it this week. Now, our next card that's out of our budget is going to be Flawless Maneuver, and this is 2 and a white for an instant. If you control a commander, you may cast this spell without paying its mana cost. Creatures you control gain Indestructible until end of turn. Now, this card is absolutely perfect for this deck and what we're trying to do, but it's a massive $15.10. So way out of our budget. However, if you have one and are willing to slot it in, so basically, as long as we have this in our hand and Tajic on board, there's nothing our opponents can really do that's going to surprise us, that's going to wipe our board. We are able to, at instant speed for free, protect our board even if we're completely tapped out. So our opponents might think, oh, they're safe, they can wipe the board, we can't protect ourselves. And then, out of nowhere, flawless maneuver saves our board, hopefully getting rid of our opponent's board at the same time. And once we have a massive board and there's no one to block, it's going to be tough for our opponents to stop us. So, flawless maneuver, phenomenal card if you got it. Feel free to slot it in. But, like I said, too much for this deck. And then, finally, our last out-of-budget upgrade is another legendary Boros creature. And this one is Aurelia the War Leader for 2, red, red, white, white. Legendary creature Angel, 3/4, flying, vigilance, haste. Whenever Aurelia the War Leader attacks for the first time each turn, untap all creatures you control. After this phase, there's an additional combat phase. So we get to get 2 attacks every single turn with Aurelia on the board. This is incredibly powerful when we're focusing on combat triggers and attack triggers. We want to be able to get value from our creatures when we start turning them sideways. So with Aurelia, we get those triggers every single turn twice. That puts us so far ahead of our opponents, and as long as they've either got no blockers, or maybe blockers that can't really stop our stuff, or we just have Odric and they can't block at all, we're going to run through them pretty fast. So Aurelia is an awesome include in this deck, and she was honestly in contention to be in the deck for a while, and I did have to cut her for budget reasons, so that's why she's here. If you are interested in Aurelia, an awesome include. But those are our out-of-budget upgrades, and that is the deck tech in general. So the last thing we've got to do is take a look at how this deck performs in a game. So we are going to run this deck up against 3 opponents. In this case, it's going to be Bilal playing his Orvar the All-Form deck, Shawn playing his Miara Thorn of the Glade and Numa Jaraga Chieftain deck, and Jason playing his Thassa Deep Dwelling deck. So starting off with Bilal's Orvar deck, this is a deck that really wants to focus on value. He wants to make a ton of copies of things with Orvar's ability, and he wants to get token copies of things that you probably shouldn't be getting extras of, particularly in Commander. So things like lands, being able to ramp in mono blue, massive creatures that have entered the battlefield effects, or even just cards like Archaeomancer, just to be able to get so much value that it'll be hard to stop him. Next up, we have Shawn and his Miara and Numa deck, which is an elf tribal deck. So Miara allows him to draw some cards, and then Numa allows him to pump up his creatures, so he's able to do a ton of damage. But this is your traditional elf deck, the elf ball style. So he wants to get a ton of elves on board as quickly as possible, make them absolutely massive, and just run his opponents over. And then finally, we have Jason's Thassa Deep Dwelling deck, which is a Blink style deck that also focuses a little bit on theft. He wants to steal some of his opponent's things, blink them so they come back under his control, and be able to outvalue his opponents in that way. So I will be honest, I think that we can probably compete with the elves when it comes to aggressiveness, but I am worried about the 2 mono blue decks on the board, because we have plenty of ways to make our creatures indestructible, to sneak in some attackers across their blockers, but if they just bounce our board, there's really not much we can do about that. So that is what I am most concerned about in this game, and the fact that there are 2 mono blue decks definitely concerns me. So we'll see how this game goes. I am looking forward to it. I hope you guys are as well, and I will talk to you all after the game. At the start of the game, I get to go first, followed by Bilal, Shawn, and then Jason. On my first turn, I play a Plains. Bilal plays an Island. Shawn plays a Terramorphic Expanse, sacrificing it to search his library for a swamp and putting it into play tapped. Jason plays an Island. I play a Mountain. Bilal plays an Island. Shawn plays a Forest, and then casts his commander Miara, Thorn of the Glade, allowing him to pay 1 mana and 1 life whenever one of his elves dies to draw a card. Jason plays an island and casts Manic Scribe, milling each opponent for 3 when it enters. At this point, Shawn also realizes he had a Leyline of Abundance in his opening hand, so he puts it into play, letting his creatures tap for an additional green mana. I play a Castle Embereth, and then cast Goblin Rabblemaster, which gets +X/+O when it attacks for each other attacking goblin, and also makes a 1/1 goblin token with haste that has to attack when I move to combat, which I do, attacking Bilal for 1. Bilal plays an island. Shawn plays a forest and casts Llanowar Visionary, drawing a card. Jason plays an island and casts Baron Talarian Archmage, returning Manic Scribe to his hand when it enters, and also drawing a card at the end of turn since one of his permanents was put back into his hand. I play a Castle Ardenvale, and then cast Frontline Medic, which gives my creatures indestructible until end of turn whenever he attacks with at least 2 other creatures, and can also be sacrificed to counter a spell with X in its casting cost. When I go to combat, I make another Goblin token, and then I attack Bilal for 2 with the tokens, and Jason for 4 with the Rabblemaster. On Bilal's turn, he plays an island. Shawn plays a swamp, and cast Poison Tip Archer, which does 1 damage to each opponent whenever any creature dies, but Bilal has the answer, countering it with a counterspell. Jason plays an island and casts Stern Proctor, returning an artifact or enchantment to its owner's hand when it enters. This winds up putting Leyline of Abundance back into Shawn's hand, and then he casts the Manic Scribe again, milling each opponent for 3 and attacking Bilal for 2. I play a mountain, and then cast Legion Warboss, which also makes a 1/1 goblin token with haste that has to attack when I move to combat, and I then move to combat, creating 2 goblin tokens, before attacking Shawn for 3, Bilal for 4, and Jason for 6. This triggers the Frontline Medic, making all my creatures indestructible until end of turn. And then, before the damage, I cast Embercleave, equipping it to the Rabblemaster, giving it +1/+1, Double Strike, and Trample. Then damage happens with Bilal taking 4, Shawn taking 3, and Jason taking 14. Bilal plays a Mystic Sanctuary, putting Whim of Volrath on top of his library from the graveyard, and then casts his commander Orvar the Allform, allowing him to create a token copy of any permanent he controls that he targets with an instant or sorcery. Shawn plays a Darkboar Pathway and recasts his Leyline of Abundance, and then casts his other commander, Numa Jaraga Chieftain, which allows him to pay X twice when he goes to combat to distribute X +1/+1 counters among elves he controls. Jason plays a Rogue's Quarter. I play a Rogue's Passage, and then cast Coveted Jewel, drawing 3 cards, but it also goes under an opponent's control if they attack me with an unblocked creature. I then move to combat, creating 2 more Goblin tokens, and attack with everything, triggering Frontline Medic, making everything indestructible, and the Warboss putting a +1/+1 counter on a Goblin. This sends 5 at Jason, 7 at Bilal, and 20 at Shawn. Before damage though, Jason casts Aetherize to return all attacking creatures to their owner's hands, completely decimating my board. In my second main phase, I recast the Frontline Medic, and then at the end of turn, Bilal casts Cerulean Wisps to turn Orvar blue until the end of turn, and draw a card. On Bilal's turn, he casts Trickery Charm, giving Orvar flying until end of turn, and then attacks me for 3, taking the Coveted Jewel, untapping it, and drawing 3 cards. Then in his second main phase, he plays an island, and then casts Jolt to untap his Mystic Sanctuary and draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep. This also triggers Orvar, creating a copy of Mystic Sanctuary, which allows him to put Jolt back on top of his deck. Shawn plays a Swamp, and then casts Awakening, which allows each player to untap all of their creatures and lands on every upkeep. He then moves to combat, paying 4 into Numa and putting 2 +1/+1 counters on him. Once in combat, he decides to attack Bilal for 4, taking control of the coveted jewel, untapping it and drawing 3. Then in his second main phase, he casts Llanowar Tribe. In Jason's upkeep, we all untap thanks to Awakening, and in response, Bilal flashes in Narumeha. Jason then casts a Peregrine Drake, untapping 5 lands when it enters, and also casts his commander, Thassa Deep Dwelling, which lets him exile a creature he controls at the end of his turn, and then return it to play, which he does, exiling Stern Proctor to once again return Leyline of Abundance to Shawn's hand. In response, Shawn casts a Putrefy to destroy the Proctor, wanting to keep his Leyline. Still in response though, Bilal then casts Dispel to counter the Putrefy, resulting in Jason keeping his creature and Shawn returning the Leyline to hand. While he still has the mana from his Leyline though, Shawn decides to cast Return of the Wildspeaker to draw 4 cards. In my upkeep, everyone untaps, and then I play a Plains and recast Goblin Rabblemaster. I also recast Legion Warboss, and then finally move to combat, creating 2 Goblin tokens, and I attack Shawn and Jason for 1 each, and Bilal for 3. This triggers my frontline medic, making all of my creatures indestructible until the end of turn. Bilal blocks with Narumeha, Jason blocks with Thassa, and Shawn takes the 1, giving me back the coveted jewel, untapping it and drawing me 3 cards. Then, before the damage, Bilal casts Essence Flux to exile Narumeha and return her to play. This also makes a copy of her with Orvar, but it dies to the legend rule. Second main phase, I cast Boros Locket, and also cast Sky Knight Vanguard, which makes a 1/1 soldier token that is tapped and attacking whenever it attacks. In Bilal's upkeep, we untap all of our creatures and lands, and he then plays an island and casts a Sphinx Mindbreaker, milling each opponent for 10 when it enters. Then, at the end of his turn, I activate Castle Ardenvale to make a 1/1 human token. In Shawn's upkeep, we again untap all of our lands and creatures. Jason's Manic Scribe also triggers now that he has Delirium, milling Shawn for 3. Shawn then moves to combat, attacking me for 1 with Miara, reclaiming the coveted jewel, untapping it and drawing 3 cards. In his second main phase, he recasts Leyline of Abundance yet again, and also casts Lysalana Huntmaster, which creates a 1/1 elf token whenever Shawn casts an elf card. He then casts Elvish Mystic, creating an elf token, and also casts Izoni Thousand-Eyed, making an elf token and 8 insect tokens since he has 8 creatures in his graveyard. After that, he plays a Path of Ancestry, and at the end of turn, Bilal casts Jolt, untapping Mystic Sanctuary, copying it with Orvar, and putting Jolt back on top of his library. He also casts a Whim of Volrath with Buyback, targeting Sphinx Mindbreaker, creating a copy of it and milling each opponent for 10. He then repeats this process, casting Whim of Volrath with Buyback, targeting Sphinx Mindbreaker, creating another copy of it, and milling each opponent for another 10 cards. Still at the end of Shawn's turn, I activate my Castle Ardenvale, making another human token. Then we all untap on Jason's upkeep, and Bilal draws for Jolt. Jason casts a Willbreaker, allowing him to take control of an opponent's creature by targeting it with a spell, and then attacks Shawn for 2, taking the coveted jewel, untapping it, and drawing 3 cards. At the end of turn, Thassa triggers, flickering the Peregrine Drake and untapping 5 lands. In response, Bilal casts Whim of Volrath 2 times, targeting the Sphinx each time, making 2 more copies of it and milling each of his opponents for 20. I also make another human token, and Shawn activates Leyline of Abundance to put a +1/+1 counter on each of his creatures, and then, with Bilal mostly tapped out, Jason decides to flash in a Dream Eater. This allows him to surveil 4 and return Orvar to Bilal's hand. In response, Bilal casts Mage's Guile to give Orvar Shroud, but Jason has the answer with Familiar's Ruse, returning Stern Proctor to his hand and countering Mage's Guile. On my turn, I cast a Knight of the White Orchid, searching my library for a Plains and putting it to hand since Bilal controls more lands than I do. We also realize I should have milled 3 in my upkeep thanks to Manic Scribe, so I do that before searching my library. I then play a Mountain and cast Mentor of the Meek, allowing me to pay 1 mana to draw a card whenever a creature power 2 or less enters the battlefield. I move to equip Embercleave to Goblin Rabblemaster, and then go to combat, but before I can do that, Bilal casts Jolt to tap my Rabblemaster, and then I make 2 more Goblin tokens, paying 1 to draw a card with the Mentor of the Meek. After that, I attack Jason for 1, retaking the Coveted Jewel, drawing 3 cards, and untapping it, then also I attack Bilal for 13. This triggers Legion Warboss, putting a counter on a Goblin and Frontline Medic, making them all indestructible. Bilal blocks as much as he can, only taking 4 total damage. Then, after all the damage has been dealt, but while we are still in combat, Jason casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift, returning all non-land permanents he doesn't control to their owner's hands, leaving his opponents with nothing on board. In Bilal's upkeep, he mills 3 thanks to Jason's Manic Scribe, and he then plays an island and recasts his commander, Orvar the Allform. After that, he casts Twitch, untapping Mystic Sanctuary, making a copy of it with Orvar, and putting Aetherize on top of his deck and drawing it. In Shawn's upkeep, he mills 3 for Manic Scribe, and then plays an Overgrown Tomb, paying 2 life to have it come in untapped, and recasts Izoni Thousand-Eyed, this time making 23 insect creature tokens when it enters. He also casts an Elvish Mystic and Joraga Treespeaker. Jason plays a Myriad Landscape and casts Salvager of Secrets, returning counterspell from his graveyard to his hand when it enters. He then moves to combat, attacking me for 2 with Peregrine Drake. At the end of turn, Thassa triggers, exiling Peregrine Drake and returning it to play, untapping 5 lands. In my upkeep, I mill 3 for Manic Scribe, and then in my first main phase, I cast Coveted Jewel again, drawing 3 cards, before playing a Plains. This allows me to cast Odric Master Tactician, allowing me to choose how creatures block if I attack with him and 3 additional creatures, and then I recast Goblin Rabblemaster, and move to combat, creating a Goblin token. The Goblin has to attack, so I decide to attack Bilal for 1, but he blocks and kills my token with his commander. In his upkeep, Bilal mills 3. He then plays an island and casts Archaeomancer, returning counterspell to his hand from the graveyard. In response, Jason activates Thassa to tap Orvar, gaining control of it thanks to Willbreaker. Still in response, Bilal decides to cast Whim of Volrath with Buyback, targeting Orvar to make a copy of his commander and sacrificing the original to the Legend rule. In Shawn's upkeep, he mills 3, and then casts an Elvish Archdruid, giving all his elves +1/+1 and tapping for mana equal to the number of elves he controls. After that, he casts In Garruk's Wake, destroying all creatures he doesn't control, before moving to combat and attacking Jason with everything he's got, which winds up being exactly 22 damage, knocking him out of the game, and he's also able to swing 6 at Bilal. On my turn, I play a Mountain and cast Sun Titan, returning Slayer's Stronghold to the battlefield when it enters. I immediately activate Slayer's Stronghold, giving Sun Titan haste and +2/+0 until the end of turn. This allows me to attack Bilal for 8, returning Paladin class to play, making my spells my opponents cast during my turn cost 1 more, and in my second main phase, I cast my commander, Tajic, Blade of the Legion. On Bilal's turn, he recasts Sphinx Mindbreaker, milling each opponent for 10, successfully milling Shawn and I out, winning Bilal the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. We came surprisingly close to winning at the end there. Being able to attack Bilal with the Sun Titan, I did have Embercleave in my hand and could have done lethal damage to him, but he was very upfront with me that he had an Aetherize in his hand, so he was able to stop my attack. So there was no point in me going for the lethal, but if I had been able to knock him out of the game and maybe survive Shawn only had 3 cards left in his library and I had 7, so there was a chance I could have won, but unfortunately, that Sphinx Mindbreaker really put in a ton of work this game. It wound up milling out 2 of the 4 players, so very impressive. I think that Bilal and Jason very early on had some of the better chances to win. I think they controlled the board very well and kind of battled back and forth for control. And even though I did a ton of damage very early on, once our board got wiped about 3 times, there wasn't much I was going to do. I was able to keep replaying my creatures, but the amount of bounce that our opponents had really made it difficult to kind of get any momentum and keep moving. So if you do put this deck together, that is something to be aware of. That is a massive downside to needing to attack and getting a ton of creatures on board, is that you're very weak to mass bounce. And then our opposing aggressive deck in Shawn also did very well. I think that he was very early on was hurt by the mill, but at the end being able to use his Izoni to make a ton of insects meant that he was very close to winning if he wasn't going to get milled out. I think that he probably could have killed Bilal on the turn that he killed Jason and things might have been different, but there's really no way to know for sure because Jason also just had a massive board at that time. So who really knows how things could have gone, but overall it was a very fun game. I really like this deck. Boros is my favorite color combination, so I'm all about turning my creatures sideways and really using a combat step to my advantage. So once again, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the gameplay, hope you enjoyed the deck tech. If you did, please do like the video and subscribe. I really appreciate it. But with all of that being said, I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.